Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The carriage wheels ground against the cobblestone streets of Savannah as it made its way through the historic district on that unusually cool morning in April of 1845. The Rousseau family had just acquired their new residence on Abercorn Street, a magnificent three-story federal-style mansion with imposing white columns and wrought-iron balconies that spoke of old money and southern aristocracy. The property sat beneath massive live oaks draped with Spanish moss that seemed to whisper secrets when the coastal breeze stirred them. It was considered one of the finest addresses in Savannah, located just a short distance from Forsyth Park and within view of the stately Mercer Williams House. According to tax records filed with Chatham County in 1845, the Rousseau family purchased the estate from the declining Wilkes family, who had fallen on hard times following a series of failed investments in cotton plantations after the financial panic of 1837. The family patriarch, Victor Rousseau, had made his fortune in the shipping industry, establishing lucrative trade routes between New Orleans, Savannah, and European ports. His wife, Eleanor, came from old Virginia wealth, and their only daughter, Amelia, had been educated at the finest finishing schools in Charleston. What made this particular acquisition noteworthy was not the property itself, but what accompanied it, specifically 17 enslaved persons who were transferred as part of the estate sale. Among them was a man named Josiah Bennett, who would later become central to one of the most disturbing incidents in Savannah's history, a case that would remain buried in courthouse archives for over 100 years before being discovered by a graduate student from Emory University in 1965. The student, whose name has been redacted from all official records, reportedly abandoned her thesis shortly after discovering the documents. Her academic advisor noted in his private correspondence that she had become unusually distressed by what she had uncovered and requested an immediate transfer to study medieval literature instead. The advisor's letters, now held in the university's special collections, mention that the student refused to discuss what she had found and seemed profoundly disturbed whenever the subject was mentioned. The documents themselves, a collection of personal diaries, medical records, court testimonies, and household ledgers, paint a portrait of events so disturbing that they were deliberately obscured by local authorities and prominent families for generations. Even now, certain descendants of Savannah's oldest families refuse to acknowledge the case, and several attempts to include it in local historical records have been mysteriously blocked. What we know with certainty is that Josiah Bennett was approximately 28 years of age when he arrived at the Rousseau household. Unlike many of the other enslaved people, he came with unusual documentation, a small, leather-bound book containing his bill of sale from a Richmond trader, a crude medical examination record, and, curiously, a letter written in French that was sealed with wax and addressed to the future owner of J.B. This letter, translated and preserved in the Chatham County Historical Archives until its mysterious disappearance in 1968, contained what appears to be a warning. The text, partially reconstructed from a researcher's notes, read, "The bearer of this letter possesses exceptional qualities that make him valuable beyond measure. However, his previous owners have noted certain peculiarities in his behavior that warrant your attention. It is strongly advised that female members of your household maintain appropriate distance." The remainder of the letter was reportedly damaged by water and time, rendering it illegible. What makes this communication unusual is not only its content, but its existence at all. Such formal documentation regarding enslaved individuals was exceptionally rare, particularly documentation suggesting special handling or treatment. Household records from the Rousseau estate indicate that Josiah was initially assigned to work as a stable hand, but his responsibilities quickly expanded to include serving as a footman, occasional valet to Victor Rousseau, and eventually personal attendant to the family. This rapid promotion through household ranks was unusual and suggests that Josiah possessed qualities that the family found valuable. Eleanor Rousseau's personal diary, recovered from a hidden compartment in an antique writing desk sold at auction in 1952, contains several entries regarding Josiah. She describes him as uncommonly handsome and possessed of manners and speech that suggest education far beyond what one would expect. She also notes with apparent concern her daughter Amelia's growing preoccupation with the man. Amelia Rousseau, 19 years old in 1845, had recently returned from her education in Charleston. By all accounts, she was considered a desirable match in Savannah society, beautiful, well-educated, and heir to the Rousseau fortune. Contemporary accounts describe her as having porcelain skin, auburn hair, and a willful disposition that her mother had failed to temper despite her best efforts. Several prominent families had already begun maneuvering to secure her hand for their sons, with the Mackays and the Styles families being particularly persistent. According to the household ledger, Amelia requested that Josiah be reassigned to serve as her personal attendant in June of 1845, approximately 2 months after the family's arrival in Savannah. Her father initially refused, but relented after Amelia claimed that their previous attendant, an older woman named Ruth, had arthritis that made it difficult for her to help with Amelia's elaborate dresses and hairstyles. The ledger notes that Ruth was reassigned to kitchen duties. What happened over the following months can only be reconstructed through fragmented records and testimonies. Amelia's personal diary, which was discovered hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been her bedroom, provides the most detailed account of the developing situation, though the reliability of her perspective has been questioned by historians who have studied the case. The diary entries begin innocuously enough. Amelia writes about her dissatisfaction with Savannah society, which she found provincial compared to Charleston. She complains about the heat, the insects, and the limited cultural offerings. Then, approximately 3 weeks after Josiah began serving as her attendant, the tone of her entries shifts dramatically. "Jay assisted me with my hair today," she writes in an entry dated July 10, 1845. "His hands are remarkably gentle, and when they brushed against my neck, I felt a most peculiar sensation. Mother would be scandalized by such thoughts, but there is something about him that sets him apart from others of his station. He speaks like an educated man when he thinks no one is listening carefully." Subsequent entries document Amelia's growing fascination with Josiah. She begins to create reasons to require his assistance, dropping items deliberately, requesting that her room be rearranged, or claiming that her dresses needed adjustment. Her diary records increasingly intimate observations about his appearance, his manner of speaking, and his reactions to her. "There is something in his eyes," she writes in August, "a depth of thought and feeling that belies his circumstances. Today, I asked him about his life before coming to us, and though he answered politely, I sensed he was concealing much. What secrets does he harbor? I find myself thinking of little else." Household records from this period show that Eleanor Rousseau had begun to notice the unusual dynamic between her daughter and Josiah. A notation in the household punishment ledger indicates that Josiah was denied his Sunday rest on 3 consecutive weeks for impertinent manner and failing to maintain proper deference. However, when Victor Rousseau was consulted about more severe punishment, he apparently declined, noting that Josiah was too valuable to damage. What makes this case particularly unusual is the evidence suggesting that Josiah himself was attempting to maintain appropriate boundaries. While many historical accounts of similar situations document the exploitation of enslaved people by those who owned them, the available evidence suggests that Josiah was actively trying to discourage Amelia's attentions while navigating the perilous position in which he found himself. A letter discovered in 1967, written by Hannah, another enslaved person in the household who worked as a laundress, to her sister who had been sold to a plantation in South Carolina, provides a rare perspective from someone who witnessed the situation developing. The letter, never sent and found hidden in a hollow space beneath a floorboard in what had been the servants' quarters, describes how Josiah would ask to be reassigned to stable duties and deliberately make himself scarce when Miss Amelia was seeking him out. Hannah writes that Josiah confided in her that nothing good would come of the young mistress's interest, and that he carried a burden that none of them could understand. By September of 1845, Amelia's diary entries had taken on an increasingly obsessive tone. She writes of watching Josiah from her window as he worked in the garden, of accidentally encountering him in isolated areas of the house, and of touching his hand deliberately when he served her at meals. She also records her frustration at his continued formality and the way he would step back whenever she came too close. "He refuses to look directly at me," she writes in an entry dated September 25th. "Today, I dropped my handkerchief deliberately before him, and though he retrieved it promptly, he placed it on the table beside me rather than returning it to my hand. Does he not sense what I feel? Or does he simply fear the consequences of acknowledging it?" The situation appears to have come to a head in early October. Amelia's diary describes how she contrived to be alone with Josiah by claiming to have twisted her ankle while walking in the garden. She instructed him to help her to the garden gazebo rather than back to the house, ensuring they would be unobserved. "I could bear it no longer," she writes. "When he helped me sit and turned to leave, I caught his wrist and told him to stay. He stood frozen, his eyes lowered, his breathing shallow. 'Look at me,' I commanded, and when he finally raised his eyes, I saw such conflict in them. I pulled him closer and whispered that I would protect him, that I had never felt this way before. When I tried to kiss him, he turned his face away. I have never known such humiliation." What happened next is documented not only in Amelia's diary, but also in the medical records of Dr. William Pritchard, who was called to the Rousseau home the following day. According to his notes, he was summoned to attend to Miss Amelia Rousseau, who was suffering from extreme nervous agitation and hysterical fever. The doctor prescribed bed rest, valerian root, and laudanum to calm her nerves. Amelia's diary entry from this period is nearly illegible, the handwriting erratic and the page stained with what appears to be tears. She describes Josiah's rejection and her subsequent emotional collapse, but more significantly, she recounts what he told her when she demanded an explanation for his refusal. "He spoke so quietly, I could barely hear him," she writes. "Miss Amelia, there are things about me you do not know, things I have been forbidden to speak of. If you insist on this path, it will bring nothing but sorrow." When I pressed him, threatening to tell father that he had been improper with me if he did not explain himself, his expression changed. For the first time I felt afraid of him, not because he threatened me, but because of the darkness that passed over his features. "Your father knows," he said. "They all know. That is why I am here." The household records show that on the same day Amelia took to her bed, Josiah was locked in the cellar space beneath the carriage house. Victor Rousseau's personal account book records a payment to 2 men from the local patrol for special night watch of the property for 3 consecutive nights. What follows in the historical record is a curious gap. For approximately 2 weeks, there are no entries in any of the recovered documents regarding either Amelia or Josiah. When the records resume, they paint a disturbing picture of escalating tensions within the household. Eleanor Rousseau's diary notes that Amelia had become sullen and withdrawn and had begun refusing food. A letter from Victor to his brother in New Orleans mentions a most distressing situation with A, and inquires about the possibility of sending her to relatives in France until the matter resolves itself or is forgotten. On October 28, 1845, Amelia's diary resumes with an entry that suggests she had discovered something significant. I found it today, the letter from Richmond that came with him. Father had it locked in his desk, but I have known where he keeps the key since I was 12. Now I understand why Jay kept his distance, why Father agreed to purchase him despite the expense, why Mother watches me so carefully at dinner when he serves. They knew all along. The letter to which Amelia refers has never been fully recovered. However, court records from Richmond, Virginia, discovered in 1963 by the same Emory graduate student who uncovered the Savannah documents, provide a possible explanation. The records describe a case from 1842 involving an enslaved man identified only as J.B., who was sold by the Whitfield family following an unspecified incident involving the youngest Whitfield daughter. The court record is deliberately vague, but testimony from the family physician indicates that the young woman had become morbidly attached to one of the household servants and had to be restrained for her own safety when he was removed from the property. The physician's notes mention that the young woman exhibited symptoms consistent with those observed in patients at the Eastern Lunatic Asylum, and that she was ultimately committed to that institution, where she died 6 months later under unclear circumstances. A separate medical examination record, referenced in the court documents but not preserved, allegedly described J.B. as having unusual physical characteristics that the examining doctor found medically significant and potentially harmful to the mental stability of susceptible females. The nature of these characteristics is not specified, though several theories have been proposed by historians and medical researchers who have studied the case. Amelia's diary indicates that whatever she discovered in the letter horrified and fascinated her in equal measure. Her entries become increasingly erratic, alternating between expressions of disgust and declarations of devotion. She writes about watching Josiah from hidden vantage points in the house, noting details about his movements, his interactions with others, and particularly his hands, which she describes repeatedly and in disturbing detail. I observed him from the library today, she writes in early November. When he thought no one was watching, he removed his gloves. I finally saw what he has been concealing. How could such a thing be? And yet, rather than repulsing me, it only strengthens my determination. He is unlike anyone else in this world, and he must be mine. On November 12th, Eleanor Rousseau's diary records that she discovered her daughter missing from her bed during a routine check in the night. A search of the house revealed that Amelia had somehow obtained the key to the room where Josiah was now being kept, a small chamber adjacent to the kitchen that had originally been used for storing preserves. Eleanor's account describes finding the door unlocked and the room empty, with no sign of either Amelia or Josiah. The household was immediately roused, and Victor Rousseau summoned the local patrol. A search of the property and surrounding areas began immediately. According to patrol records, tracking dogs were brought in at dawn, and several neighboring plantations were notified to be on alert for the missing pair. Amelia and Josiah were discovered late the following day at an abandoned rice mill approximately 12 miles outside Savannah. The patrol report, filed with the county sheriff, describes finding Amelia in a state of extreme dishabille and mental disturbance, and Josiah unconscious from what appeared to be self-administered laudanum. The report notes that when Josiah was roused, he made no attempt to flee or resist capture, and in fact expressed relief at being found. What happened next is documented in multiple sources, though with varying degrees of detail and reliability. Josiah was immediately taken into custody and held in the Savannah jail, pending disposition by his owner. Amelia was returned to the Rousseau home, where, according to Eleanor's diary, she was confined to her room under the supervision of 2 female attendants brought in from Charleston specifically for that purpose. Dr. Pritchard was again summoned to the Rousseau home. His medical notes from this visit are unusually detailed and provide one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. He describes Amelia as being in a state of manic excitement, alternating with periods of stuporous melancholy. More significantly, he notes physical symptoms that caused him great concern. The patient presents with unusual markings on her wrists, neck, and upper torso, consistent with prolonged contact with a caustic or corrosive substance. The affected skin shows blistering and discoloration of a most alarming nature. Miss Rousseau refuses to explain how these injuries occurred, alternately claiming they are love tokens and then dissolving into hysterical laughter. Victor Rousseau's personal correspondence from this period includes an urgent letter to a doctor. Harrington at the Georgia State Asylum in Milledgeville, inquiring about immediate private accommodation for a young lady of good family suffering from acute melancholia and delusional attachments. The letter specifically requests facilities that would allow the patient to be kept apart from common lunatics and others who might disturb her recovery. Parallel to these developments, the fate of Josiah Bennett was being determined through a different channel. Court records from Chatham County indicate that Victor Rousseau filed a petition for a special hearing regarding disposal of unusual property on November 18, 1845. The petition requested that the court convene in private session due to the sensitive and potentially disturbing nature of the matter at hand. The transcript of this hearing, sealed until 1965, and even then only partially released, provides the clearest picture of what may have been at the heart of the case. The hearing began with testimony from Victor Rousseau, who described acquiring Josiah as part of the estate purchase and being warned by the previous owner about special precautions that should be taken. He testified that he had been assured that if these precautions were observed, specifically limiting Josiah's contact with the women of the household and requiring him to wear gloves at all times, there would be no cause for concern. The most significant testimony came from Dr. Alexander Posey, who identified himself as having examined Josiah both upon his arrival in Savannah and again following his capture with Amelia. Dr. Posey's clinical description, rendered in the dispassionate language of 19th-century medicine, suggests that Josiah had a rare condition affecting his skin, particularly his hands. The subject presents with an anomalous dermal condition, unlike any I have encountered in 30 years of medical practice, Dr. Posey testified. The epidermis of his hands and forearms produces a substance that, upon prolonged contact with normal human skin, causes a reaction similar to that observed in cases of chemical burning. More disturbing is the apparent neurological effect this substance seems to have when absorbed through the skin. Subjects exposed to it report sensations of euphoria, followed by growing attachment and obsessive fixation on the source of the exposure. Dr. Posey further testified that he believed the condition to be congenital rather than acquired, and that Josiah had demonstrated awareness of his condition and had generally taken precautions to prevent skin-to-skin contact with others. He noted that similar cases had been documented in medical literature from the Caribbean and hypothesized a possible connection to tropical diseases or environmental factors. The court transcript records that Victor Rousseau then petitioned for permission to transport Josiah to medical researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, who had expressed interest in studying such unusual cases. The court granted this request with the provision that Josiah would remain legally the property of Rousseau and would be returned to Savannah following the conclusion of the studies. What happened to Josiah after his removal from Savannah is not fully documented. A receipt from a specialized transportation company shows that a secure coach was commissioned by Victor Rousseau on November 25, 1845, for conveyance of valuable property to Philadelphia. However, no records have been found confirming Josiah's arrival at the University of Pennsylvania or any subsequent medical studies. The fate of Amelia Rousseau is somewhat better documented. Admission records from the Georgia State Asylum confirm that a Miss A.R. of Savannah was admitted as a private patient on December 3, 1845. The admitting physician noted that she arrived with unusual dermal lesions requiring daily treatment and exhibited persistent delusions regarding a lost love whom she describes as having miraculous properties. Treatment notes from the asylum record that Amelia's physical symptoms gradually improved, but her mental state remained unstable. She alternated between periods of apparent lucidity, during which she would engage in normal activities such as reading and needlework, and episodes of extreme agitation during which she would attempt to escape, claiming that "he is calling to me through my blood." A particularly disturbing note from June 1846 describes an incident in which Amelia was discovered in the asylum garden, having apparently deliberately injured her hands with thorns from the rose bushes. When questioned, she allegedly replied that she was trying to make her hands like his, so that they could be together properly. Eleanor Rousseau's diary contains only 3 references to Amelia after her commitment to the asylum. The first, dated Christmas Day, 1845, simply states, "Visited A today. She did not recognize me. Perhaps that is God's mercy." The second, from April 1846, notes, "Dr. H. advises against further visits. Says they excite her unduly and set back her treatment. Victor agrees we must follow medical advice, though it breaks my heart." The final entry from October 1847 reads only, "2 years since the calamity. I still wake in the night thinking I hear her footsteps in the hall." The Rousseau family left Savannah in 1848, selling their mansion on Abercorn Street and relocating to Boston. City directories and tax records indicate that Victor established a new shipping business there, though on a much smaller scale than his previous operations. Eleanor Rousseau died in 1853, according to an obituary in the Boston Evening Transcript that makes no mention of a daughter. Asylum records show that Amelia Rousseau remained at the Georgia State Asylum until a fire destroyed part of the facility in 1854. The official report states that all patients were safely evacuated, and Amelia is listed among those transferred to a temporary facility in Augusta. However, her name does not appear on subsequent patient rolls or transfer documents. An administrative note from 1855 simply states, "Case of A.R. closed, deceased," with no further details provided. The final documented reference to this case comes from an unusual source. In 1869, a physician named Dr. James Woodward published a monograph titled "Unusual Dermatological Cases Observed in the American South," which includes a brief account of a patient he encountered while traveling in Louisiana in 1858. He describes treating a man of mixed race, approximately 40 years of age, living in seclusion in a remote cabin in the Bayou country. This individual, whom Woodward identifies only as J, suffered from a rare skin condition that caused his touch to produce blistering and subsequent neurological effects in others. Woodward writes that the man lived alone by choice, wearing gloves whenever he needed to interact with others, and supporting himself by crafting intricate wooden carvings that he sold through an intermediary. Most significantly, Woodward notes that the man possessed a level of education and refinement incongruous with his circumstances, and that he claimed to have once been the subject of medical study in Philadelphia, from which he escaped when he discovered the researcher's true intentions. Whether this individual was indeed Josiah Bennett cannot be confirmed with certainty. Woodward's monograph includes no further identifying details, and his personal papers, which might have contained additional information, were reportedly lost when his New Orleans office was flooded during a hurricane in 1871. The story of Josiah Bennett and Amelia Rousseau might have remained buried in scattered archives and forgotten documents had it not been for the persistent research of that unnamed Emory graduate student in 1965. Even then, the full details of the case might never have come to light if not for a curious coincidence. In 1967, during renovations to one of Savannah's historic homes on Abercorn Street, the very house once owned by the Rousseau family, workers discovered a small metal box sealed inside a wall cavity. The box contained a leather-bound journal, a pair of deteriorated white gloves, and a glass vial containing what appeared to be a dried residue of some kind. The journal was identified as belonging to Amelia Rousseau, containing entries not found in her previously discovered diary. The final pages of this journal, dated November 1845, during the brief period when she and Josiah had fled together, provide the most disturbing conclusion to this already unsettling case. In increasingly erratic handwriting, Amelia describes how Josiah finally revealed to her the full truth about his condition after she had threatened to harm herself if he continued to reject her advances. "He showed me his hands tonight," she writes, removed his gloves and held them before the firelight. They seemed to glisten with a subtle sheen, like morning dew on spider silk. When I reached to touch them, he pulled away, but I would not be denied. The sensation when my skin met his was beyond description, a burning that transformed into the most exquisite pleasure. He tried to pull away, but I held fast, watching as my flesh reddened and blistered beneath his touch. He wept as he told me what happens to those who touch him this way, how the initial pleasure gives way to something darker, an obsession, a hunger that can never be satisfied, how the Whitfield girl had wasted away, unable to eat or sleep, thinking only of his touch, how others before her had suffered the same fate. He was born with this curse, he told me, discovered as a child when his mother embraced him and then could not bear to be separated from him, eventually dying from her obsession. He believes it is a poison his skin produces, but I know better. It is love in its purest form, a connection so profound that ordinary existence becomes unbearable by comparison. I understand now why they kept us apart, why they feared what we might become together, but it is too late for their precautions. His essence flows in my veins now, transforming me. Soon we will be inseparable, as we were meant to be. The final entry, barely legible and trailing off mid-sentence, reads, "He sleeps now. I added the laudanum to his tea without his knowledge. When the men come, and I know they will come, they will take him back. They will study him, dissect him perhaps, trying to understand what makes him different. I cannot allow that. I have taken his small knife and will open my veins, letting our miracle mingle with my blood. When they find us, it will be too late. We will be together beyond their reach, beyond their understanding. His touch has already claimed me. Now I will claim..." According to the report filed by the Historical Society member who examined the journal, the glass vial found with it was sent to a laboratory for analysis in 1968. The results of this analysis have never been made public. Both the journal and the vial were subsequently transferred to a special collection at the University of Georgia, where they were to be held under restricted access for 50 years. However, when researchers attempted to access these items after the restriction period expired, they were informed that the materials had been misplaced during an institutional reorganization and could not be located. Inquiries to the university's administration have consistently been met with denials that such items were ever in their possession. The house on Abercorn Street, where the hidden journal was discovered, has changed hands multiple times since 1967. Several owners have reported unusual occurrences, persistent skin rashes that develop suddenly and resist treatment, unexplained feelings of euphoria followed by deep melancholy, and in one particularly disturbing case, a teenage girl who became so obsessed with the history of the house that she had to be removed from the property for her own well-being. Local tour guides now include the Russo-Bennett tragedy in their ghost tours of Savannah, though the stories they tell bear little resemblance to the documented facts of the case. They speak of forbidden love, of voodoo curses, of poison and revenge. The truth, as pieced together from fragmented historical records, is perhaps more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. A story of a man whose very touch could inspire obsession, and a woman who chose to embrace destruction rather than live without it. In 1969, a small notation was added to the historical register of Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, indicating that an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field section had been identified as possibly belonging to A.R., 1826 to 1845. A simple stone was placed there, bearing only these dates and the inscription, "The touch that burns also illuminates." No trace of Josiah Bennett has ever been conclusively found beyond Dr. Woodward's account of the solitary craftsman in the Louisiana bayou. If he did indeed escape from medical researchers in Philadelphia, he appears to have successfully disappeared from historical record, perhaps finding the isolation he sought, free from the burden of human contact and the suffering his touch could bring. The true nature of Josiah's condition remains a medical mystery. Modern physicians who have reviewed the limited available evidence have proposed various explanations, from a unique form of contact dermatitis to the secretion of psychoactive compounds through the skin. Some have even suggested that the entire case might have been a fabrication, an elaborate fiction created to explain away a socially unacceptable relationship. However, the physical evidence, the journal, the medical records, the consistent testimonies from multiple sources, suggests that whatever affected Josiah Bennett was real, at least in its consequences. In 1968, the graduate student who first uncovered the case files published a single academic article titled "Touch as Contagion, Physiological Determinism and Social Control in Antebellum Savannah." Shortly after its publication, she withdrew from academic life entirely and reportedly moved to a remote area of Maine. Attempts to contact her for further comment on her discoveries have been unsuccessful. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this case is not what we know, but what remains hidden. The missing letter from Richmond, the lost research records from Philadelphia, the disappeared journal and vial, all suggest a deliberate effort to obscure the full truth about Josiah Bennett and his unusual condition. Whether this effort stems from scientific skepticism, social embarrassment, or something more sinister remains unclear. What is clear is that in the autumn of 1845, something extraordinary and terrible occurred in a mansion on Abercorn Street in Savannah. A man whose touch could both entrance and destroy. A woman who chose obsession over safety, and a society that, confronted with something it could not understand, chose to lock it away and forget. Local residents dismiss such stories as tourist imagination, but some old families still warn their children to wear gloves when touching the wrought iron fences of certain properties, just to be safe. In the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, A notation in the margin of a document related to the Rousseau family reads simply, "Some fires burn most brightly in darkness, and some touches leave marks that never fade." Whether this was added by a researcher, an archivist, or someone with more personal knowledge of the case remains unknown. Visitors to Savannah sometimes report a strange sensation when passing by certain houses on Abercorn Street, a tingling in their fingers, a momentary euphoria followed by an inexplicable longing. And perhaps in the end, that is the most appropriate legacy for Josiah Bennett and Amelia Rousseau, a story that touches us across time, leaving marks that both burn and illuminate, reminding us that some hungers, once awakened, can never truly be satisfied. A story that, like Josiah himself, should perhaps be approached with caution, with boundaries, with the understanding that to know something fully is sometimes to be consumed by it entirely. In a small museum collection in Louisiana, there exists a wooden carving of intertwined hands, one slightly larger, one delicate and feminine, attributed to unknown craftsman, circa 1860. The curator's notes mention that visitors often report an unusual sensation when viewing the piece, a warmth in their own hands, a quickening of pulse, and occasionally a lingering sense of melancholy that persists long after they have left the museum. The carving bears no signature, only a small, barely visible inscription carved into the base. What separates also binds. In 1969, a small notation was added to the historical register of Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, indicating that an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field section had been identified as possibly belonging to A.R., 1826 to 1845. A simple stone was placed there, bearing only these dates, and the inscription, "The touch that burns also illuminates." No trace of Josiah Bennett has ever been conclusively found beyond Dr. Woodward's account of the solitary craftsman in the Louisiana bayou. If he did indeed escape from medical researchers in Philadelphia, he appears to have successfully disappeared from historical record, perhaps finding the isolation he sought, free from the burden of human contact and the suffering his touch could bring. The true nature of Josiah's condition remains a medical mystery. Modern physicians who have reviewed the limited available evidence have proposed various explanations, from a unique form of contact dermatitis to the secretion of psychoactive compounds through the skin. Some have even suggested that the entire case might have been a fabrication, an elaborate fiction created to explain away a socially unacceptable relationship. However, the physical evidence, the journal, the medical records, the consistent testimonies from multiple sources, suggests that whatever affected Josiah Bennett was real, at least in its consequences. In 1968, the graduate student who first uncovered the case files published a single academic article titled "Touch as Contagion: Physiological Determinism and Social Control in Antebellum Savannah." Shortly after its publication, she withdrew from academic life entirely and reportedly moved to a remote area of Maine. Attempts to contact her for further comment on her discoveries have been unsuccessful. Interviews conducted in 1962 with elderly residents of Savannah yielded another disturbing connection to the case. Martha Williams, then 97 years old, and a descendant of one of the oldest families in the city, recounted a story told to her by her grandmother about the man with poisoned hands. According to Williams, her grandmother had been a young girl in Savannah society when the incident occurred and remembered the hushed conversations among the adults. "They said his touch was like opium," Williams recalled. "Once felt, it created a hunger nothing else could satisfy. My grandmother said she once saw the Rousseau girl at church before it all happened, said she was beautiful, refined, everything a young lady should be. Then later she caught a glimpse of her being taken to the asylum carriage." said she wouldn't have recognized her if not told who she was, wild-eyed, hair shorn, her arms covered in bandages, screaming a name over and over. When asked what name the girl had been screaming, Williams grew noticeably uncomfortable. "My grandmother would never speak it aloud," she said. Said some names call their owners when spoken. Williams died 3 months after this interview, and her family denied requests for follow-up conversations, claiming she had been confused in her old age, and that her stories were fanciful inventions. The Savannah Historical Society archives contain an intriguing document dated 1872, a letter from Victor Rousseau, then living in Boston, to the director of the Georgia State Asylum. In it, he inquires whether any personal effects belonging to his daughter might have survived the 1854 fire. He specifically mentions a small leather pouch containing a lock of hair that Amelia had apparently kept with her during her confinement. The director's response, if it was ever sent, has not been preserved. What makes this letter notable is that it contradicts the official record stating that Amelia Rousseau died in 1855. If Victor believed items belonging to his daughter might still be held at the asylum in 1872, it suggests he either did not know of her reported death or did not believe it had occurred. This discrepancy prompted further research by historians in the 1970s, who discovered a curious entry in the admission records of the Massachusetts State Lunatic Hospital at Worcester. On January 18, 1856, a patient identified only as A.B. was admitted at private expense, with instructions that she was to have no visitors except for an elderly gentleman who paid for her care. The patient is described as 29 years of age, suffering from monomania and dermatological afflictions of unknown origin. She remained at the facility until 1878, when she was recorded as having died of natural causes accelerated by self-neglect. The attending physician's notes on this patient include several disturbing observations. He writes that she consistently wore gloves, removing them only in private, and that she had to be prevented from collecting noxious substances from the hospital garden, which she apparently attempted to apply to her skin. Most notably, he records that in her lucid moments she would speak eloquently about a scientific theory she had developed regarding transdermal emotional contagion, and claimed to have experienced it firsthand. The connection between this mysterious patient and Amelia Rousseau remains speculative, but the coincidence of dates, described symptoms, and the private funding of her care suggest a compelling possibility that Victor Rousseau faked his daughter's death in Georgia and transferred her to a facility closer to his new home in Boston, where he could monitor her condition while keeping her isolated from society. In 1973, renovations at the former Massachusetts State Lunatic Hospital uncovered a hidden cache of patient belongings that had apparently been sealed in a wall cavity during previous construction. Among these items was a small wooden box containing several objects, a pair of deteriorated leather gloves, much too large for a woman's hands, a journal with most pages torn out, the remaining ones filled with the same phrase written over and over, "His touch lives in my blood," and most unusually, a glass bottle containing traces of a dried substance. Analysis of this substance at the University of Massachusetts laboratory revealed an unusual compound with chemical properties unlike any known natural substance. The lead chemist described it as having structural similarities to both endorphins and certain psychoactive alkaloids, but with molecular characteristics that would be extremely unlikely to occur naturally. When asked to speculate on its origin, he suggested it might be a sophisticated pharmaceutical preparation, though he acknowledged that producing such a compound would have been beyond the chemical knowledge of the mid-19th century. This discovery prompted renewed interest in the case among medical researchers specializing in rare dermatological conditions. In 1974, Dr. Helen Montgomery published a paper in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology titled Theoretical Pathways for Transdermal Neurotoxin Secretion in Humans, which referenced the Josiah Bennett case as a possible historical example of a condition she termed psychoactive hyperhidrosis, a hypothetical disorder in which the sweat glands secrete compounds that affect the nervous system of others upon contact. Dr. Montgomery's research notes, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1996, reveal that her initial paper had contained much more specific references to the Bennett-Rousseau case, including speculation about genetic factors that might produce such a condition. These sections were apparently removed at the insistence of the journal's editors, who deemed them too speculative and potentially alarming to the public without more substantial evidence. What is particularly intriguing about Dr. Montgomery's unpublished notes is her reference to two other historical cases that she believed might represent the same condition. A 17th-century account from Haiti of a man whose touch allegedly caused possession in women, and an 1830s case from New Orleans involving a mixed-race fortune-teller whose clients became addicted to her predictions. Dr. Montgomery hypothesized a genetic link between these cases, suggesting the condition might follow familial lines across generations. Her notes also mention her unsuccessful attempts to locate descendants of the Whitfield family from Richmond who had owned Josiah before the Rousseaus. She speculates that if Josiah's condition was congenital, as Dr. Posey had suggested in his testimony, there might be relatives who shared some version of the trait. However, her search was hampered by incomplete records and the disruption caused by the Civil War, which had destroyed many of Richmond's documents. In 1978, a librarian at the University of Pennsylvania discovered an unmarked leather portfolio tucked behind other volumes on a seldom-used shelf in the medical library's rare book room. The portfolio contained what appeared to be research notes from 1846, documenting a series of tests performed on an unnamed male subject of African descent with unusual dermatological presentation. The notes describe attempts to collect and analyze secretions from the subject's skin, with observations about the effects these secretions had on laboratory animals and, more disturbingly, on a volunteer subject, who is later referred to as becoming unsuitable for further testing due to developing unhealthy attachment to the research subject. The final entry in these notes, dated March 3, 1846, tersely states, "Subject missing this morning." Evidence suggests assistance from within the facility, investigation ongoing, all samples and extracts secured in private storage. There is no record of what became of these samples, or whether the subject was ever located. The librarian who discovered these documents reportedly developed an intense scholarly interest in the case, dedicating increasing amounts of time to researching it and eventually requesting a sabbatical to travel to Savannah for further investigation. According to her colleagues, she returned from this trip noticeably changed, withdrawn, obsessive about her research, and reluctant to discuss her findings. She resigned from her position 6 months later, citing health concerns. Attempts to contact her for this investigation were unsuccessful. Her former department reported that she had moved abroad and left no forwarding address. In 1982, a historical researcher named Thomas Blackwood began systematically investigating the Bennett-Rousseau case, tracing property records, tax documents, slave sales, and medical archives across multiple states. His research led him to a small town in Louisiana, where local records suggested a man matching Josiah's description had lived from approximately 1858 to 1875. According to Blackwood's notes, this individual was known locally as Jerome the Carver and lived in isolation in the bayou, creating intricate wooden sculptures that were sold in New Orleans through an intermediary. Local legend held that Jerome always wore gloves when conducting business and never allowed anyone to touch him directly. He was described as educated, soft-spoken, and unfailingly polite, but firm in maintaining his solitude. The only person who regularly visited him was reportedly a local herb woman of mixed Choctaw and French ancestry, who was said to provide him with special preparations that he applied to his skin. Blackwood's research took an unusual turn when he discovered that this herb woman, identified in parish records as Marie Laveau, no relation to the famous voodoo queen of the same name, had kept detailed records of her preparations and clients. These records, preserved by her granddaughter, included references to special gloves prepared for Jay that were treated with a mixture of herbs, minerals, and animal-derived ingredients that supposedly contained his nature and allowed him to interact safely with others when necessary. Most intriguing was a notation from 1871, which recorded Jerome requesting twice the usual preparation and mentioning that he expected a visitor from the north. The notation includes Marie's observation that Jerome seemed troubled by this expected meeting and had asked her whether her preparations could remove his condition entirely rather than simply containing it. She had apparently told him that such a cure was beyond her abilities. No record exists of who this northern visitor might have been, but Blackwood uncovered an intriguing possibility in the travel records of Victor Rousseau. A business ledger from 1871 shows that Victor undertook a journey to New Orleans in April of that year, ostensibly to meet with shipping contacts. The ledger records his expenses for the main journey, but includes a curious gap of 4 days, during which no expenses are noted. Following this gap, there is an entry for the purchase of medical supplies and a substantial payment to an unnamed local guide. Blackwood's research notes suggest he became convinced that Victor Rousseau had located Josiah Bennett after more than 25 years and had journeyed to Louisiana to confront him. What transpired during this meeting, if it indeed occurred, remains unknown. Victor Rousseau returned to Boston and, according to family correspondence, became increasingly reclusive. He died in 1874, leaving the bulk of his estate to medical research at Harvard University, with specific instructions that the funds be used to study conditions of the skin and their effects on the nervous system. In 1876, parish records in Louisiana note the death of Jerome, carver of wood, with the cause listed as fever. The record indicates he was buried in unmarked grave near his cabin at his own prior request. A curious addendum to this record, added in a different hand, states, "All personal effects burned as specified. Cabin site to be abandoned, not resold." Blackwood's investigation into the Bennett-Rousseau case ended abruptly in 1983, when he reportedly suffered a mental breakdown during a research trip to Savannah. According to the police report, he was found in the garden of the house on Abercorn Street, formerly owned by the Rousseau family, attempting to dig up the flower beds with his bare hands, which had become severely blistered and infected. When questioned, he allegedly claimed he was looking for traces of him in the soil and insisted that he could feel it calling through the ground. Blackwood was hospitalized for several weeks and subsequently abandoned his research, refusing to discuss it even with close colleagues. His collected notes and documents were donated to the Georgia Historical Society under the condition that they remain sealed until 25 years after his death. Blackwood died in 1997, and his materials became available to researchers in 2022. Among these materials was a personal journal in which Blackwood had recorded his own experiences while researching the case. The final entries suggest that he had become convinced that Josiah Bennett's condition might have left lasting traces in locations where he had lived for extended periods. Blackwood describes developing unexplained skin irritations while examining artifacts associated with the case and experiencing unusual sensory phenomena when visiting sites connected to Josiah and Amelia. Most disturbing is his account of spending a night in a hotel room overlooking Bonaventure Cemetery, where Amelia's supposed grave is located. He writes, "Dreamt of hands reaching through soil, of skin that glistens in moonlight. Woke to find my own hands pressed against the window glass as if trying to reach something in the cemetery below. The sensation of yearning was so intense, it was physically painful. I understand now what she felt, why she could not bear to be separated from him. It lingers in places, in objects, perhaps even in the records of their story. To research this case is to risk infection by it. The current owners of the house on Abercorn Street have reported no unusual occurrences since purchasing the property in 2015, though they note that tourist guides often stop outside to recount greatly exaggerated versions of the Bennett Rousseau story. The owners have stated in local interviews that they view such stories as colourful local folklore and part of Savannah's appeal to visitors interested in the macabre. However, a gardener employed by the family provided a different perspective when interviewed anonymously. He claimed that the soil in certain parts of the garden is different from the surrounding areas, warmer somehow even in winter. He also mentioned that gloves worn while working those specific flower beds tend to deteriorate unusually quickly, and that he has experienced strange dreams after working long days on the property. In 2019, a dermatological researcher at Emory University published a paper proposing that what was described in the historical record as Josiah Bennett's condition might have been an extreme form of chrome hydrosis, a rare condition in which the sweat glands produce colored secretions, combined with an undiagnosed genetic disorder affecting the composition of these secretions. The paper suggests that certain compounds produced naturally in human sweat could, in theory, be concentrated to levels that might affect the nervous system of others, creating sensations similar to those described in the Bennett Rousseau case. The researcher noted that while no documented case has ever approached the extreme effects attributed to Josiah Bennett, the underlying physiological mechanisms for such a condition are not entirely implausible. The paper concludes by observing that modern understanding of neuroactive compounds and their delivery methods suggests that what seemed supernatural or inexplicable in the 19th century might have been an extremely rare medical condition that, with contemporary knowledge, could potentially be treated or managed. This rational scientific explanation might provide comfort to those disturbed by the Bennett Rousseau story, a reassurance that even the most unsettling historical accounts can ultimately be understood through the lens of modern medicine. Yet questions remain that resist such neat categorization. Why did multiple researchers who studied the case subsequently abandon their work and withdraw from public life? What became of the samples allegedly collected at the University of Pennsylvania? Why did Victor Rousseau, after apparently locating Josiah in Louisiana, return to Boston and dedicate his fortune to studying skin conditions? And perhaps most disturbingly, why do certain locations associated with the case continue to produce unusual effects on those who spend time there? In 2020, a small exhibition at the Savannah Historical Society featured artifacts tangentially related to the Bennett Rousseau case, including period clothing similar to what would have been worn by the principals, photographs of the Abercorn Street house, and reproductions of relevant documents. The exhibition proved unexpectedly popular, drawing visitors from across the country. The curator noted with some concern that several visitors returned multiple times, spending hours examining the displays, with some requesting permission to touch the artifacts, which was, of course, denied. One visitor, a woman in her 30s who declined to give her name, attended the exhibition every day during its 2-week run. On the final day, she approached the curator and asked whether any original items belonging to either Josiah or Amelia had been included in the display. When told that no such items existed in the Society's collection, she appeared visibly relieved. "That's good," she reportedly said. "Some things shouldn't be touched, even after all this time." She then showed the curator her hands, which were covered in a red, blistering rash that she claimed had developed shortly after her first visit to the exhibition. The curator, alarmed, suggested she seek medical attention, but the woman smiled and said, "It doesn't hurt. Actually, it feels wonderful, like I'm finally awake after being asleep my whole life. I just keep wanting to come back, to be near the story. Isn't that strange?" The curator reported this incident to her supervisors, but by the time anyone followed up, the woman had disappeared and could not be located. In 2022, a graduate student in historical anthropology at the University of Georgia began researching the language patterns in Amelia Rousseau's recovered journals, comparing them with other 19th-century women's diaries to identify linguistic markers of psychological distress. The resulting paper, Lexical Patterns of Obsession in Historical Narratives, noted that Amelia's writing exhibited unusual repetition, intensification of sensory descriptions, and a preoccupation with physical sensation that the researcher suggested might indicate a neurological component to her psychological state. What makes this research particularly notable is that the graduate student abruptly suspended her studies 3 months after beginning work with the journal. Transcriptions, citing personal health concerns. In a brief email to her advisor, later shared with this investigation, she mentioned experiencing unusual dreams and a persistent sensation of something on my skin that medical examinations had been unable to diagnose. When contacted for this account, the former student declined to discuss specific details of her experience, but did offer one observation. "Some stories get under your skin, not just figuratively, but almost literally. The more I immersed myself in Amelia's words, the more I felt what she described. It was as if her obsession was somehow contagious, transmitted through time by the very act of engaging with her story. I had to step away for my own well-being." In 2023, a specialist in historical preservation was contracted to assess several properties in Savannah's historic district, including the house on Abercorn Street. During his examination of the garden area, he discovered a small underground chamber that appeared to have once been a storage space or root cellar, but had been sealed off at some point in the past. Inside, he found several items apparently undisturbed for decades: a pair of deteriorated leather gloves, a glass jar containing traces of an unidentified substance, and most notably, a small leather-bound book with a single entry dated November 1845. The text, barely legible due to water damage and time, appeared to be written in a masculine hand, unlike Amelia's documented handwriting. It read simply, "I have tried to contain what flows from me, to prevent the harm it causes. A believes it is a gift, a sign of something special between us. She cannot understand that what feels like love to her is merely the poison working through her system, creating a hunger that can never be satisfied. I have seen it before. The initial euphoria, the growing obsession, the complete dissolution of self. I cannot bear to be the cause of such suffering again. Tomorrow, I will end this cycle, for her sake and for all who might come after. May God forgive what I cannot change." The book and other items were transferred to the Savannah Historical Society for preservation and study. However, before any detailed analysis could be performed, a fire broke out in the storage area where they were being kept, destroying these artifacts along with several others. The fire was attributed to faulty electrical wiring, though some staff members privately expressed skepticism about this explanation, noting that no electrical systems ran through that particular section of the building. In 2024, genetic researchers at the University of Pennsylvania launched a project to identify potential biological mechanisms that might explain historical accounts of unusual medical conditions. Though not specifically focused on the Bennett-Rousseau case, their published findings included speculation about a theoretical condition they termed neurochemical dermal transmission syndrome, a hypothetical disorder in which the skin produces compounds that, upon contact with others, affect brain chemistry in ways that create sensations of euphoria followed by psychological attachment. The researchers noted that while no documented case of this exact syndrome exists in modern medical literature, advances in understanding of transdermal drug delivery systems and neurochemical manipulation suggest such a condition is not biologically impossible. They concluded that historical accounts of toxic touch or addictive contact might represent early observations of rare neurological and dermatological conditions that were poorly understood at the time. This scientific perspective offers a framework for understanding the Bennett-Rousseau case without resorting to supernatural explanations or dismissing it entirely as historical fabrication. Yet, it does not fully account for the pattern of effects the case seems to have on those who study it closely. The recurring themes of obsession, withdrawal, and unexplained physical symptoms that have affected researchers across generations. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Bennett-Rousseau story is not what happened in 1845, but what continues to happen when people engage deeply with the case, like a contagion passed not through physical contact, but through knowledge itself. The story seems to affect those who immerse themselves in it, creating a kind of obsession that mirrors, in milder form, what Amelia herself experienced. Is this simply the power of suggestion, a kind of psychosomatic response to a compelling narrative, or is there something more tangible at work, some aspect of Josiah's condition that has been preserved in the objects, locations, and perhaps even in the records of what occurred? The house on Abercorn Street stands today, as it has for nearly 200 years, its elegant facade giving no indication of the events that transpired within its walls. Tourists pass by, hearing sanitized versions of the story from guides who emphasize its romantic elements while downplaying its more disturbing implications. Few visitors realize that they may be standing on the very ground where Josiah Bennett once walked, his gloved hands carefully ensuring that he touched no one directly. In Bonaventure Cemetery, the small marker possibly identifying Amelia Rousseau's grave has become worn with time, the inscription barely legible. Yet visitors occasionally leave small tokens there, a pair of gloves, a pressed flower, a handwritten note. The cemetery caretakers report finding these items regularly and removing them, only to discover new ones appearing within days. Somewhere in the archives of universities, historical societies, and private collections, fragments of the Bennett-Rousseau story remain scattered. A letter here, a medical record there, pieces of a puzzle that no one has fully assembled. Perhaps this is for the best. As multiple researchers have discovered, to immerse oneself too deeply in this case is to risk being changed by it, to begin feeling echoes of what Amelia felt, an inexplicable longing for something that can only harm, an obsession that consumes reason. In the end, the story of Josiah Bennett and Amelia Rousseau may be most valuable not as a historical curiosity, but as a metaphor. A caution about the nature of obsession itself, about desires that consume rather than fulfill, about the human capacity to choose destruction disguised as love. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous touch is not the one that burns the skin, but the one that burns itself into memory and refuses to fade, calling across time to those who listen too closely, who look too long, who allow themselves to be drawn into a narrative that has no satisfying conclusion, only the lingering sensation of something essential forever out of reach. And perhaps somewhere, in a forgotten corner of Savannah or in the remote Louisiana bayou, something of Josiah still remains, in the soil where he walked, in objects he touched, in the very molecules of air, in places where he lived. Not a ghost in the conventional sense, but a biochemical echo, a trace of the condition that made him both fascinating and dangerous, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of curiosity and vulnerability. Those who study the Bennett Rousseau case are advised to maintain professional distance, to treat it as they would any historical account, with objectivity, skepticism, and careful attention to verifiable facts. And perhaps, as a precaution that Josiah himself would appreciate, to wear gloves when handling any documents associated with the case. For some stories reach across time not merely to inform or entertain, but to touch us in ways we cannot fully comprehend. And once touched, we may find ourselves changed in ways both subtle and profound, carrying within us a lingering trace of people long dead but never truly gone, a psychic fingerprint that, like Josiah's touch, both burns and illuminates.